And
Yeah.
I mentioned when we were talking about Leibniz's thought experiment, your concept of homuncular functionalism. So maybe
Yeah.
that's a good
Yeah.
place to start.
Yeah. And it's a good place to start because I can use it to confess to one of my biggest philosophical mistakes. In my first book, In Content and Consciousness, I had this jokey line where I said that the language of thought hypothesis, as put forward by Fodor and others, seemed to me to be not such a good idea because it merely replaced the little man in the brain with a committee. And that was sort of a punchy quip, but I was being seduced by a punchy quip. And I later came to realize, no, replacing the little man in the brain with a committee is progress. What we have to do is see that instead of there being one all-powerful agent in there sitting in the control room, the self, the ego, the Cartesian race cogitans, you should recognize that what a mind is composed of a lot of agents, a lot of smaller, lesser agencies. A committee, well, an army, hordes of armies of little agents that have particular competences that are somehow, and this is a hard empirical question, somehow enlisted to common cause. And there's competition and there's collaboration.
Feral neurons.
In the brain.
Is a term. A feral neurons is a term you use that I like.
Yes. Yes. It's an idea that I don't know whether I want to push it hard or not, but it's a possibility I want to explore. Many neurons seem to have rather boring workaday lives. They transmit just a few fairly simple messages. They do it dutifully, but they're pretty much just go-betweens. But some neurons seem to be more enterprising. They seem to be risk takers. And the idea that we could actually distinguish a class of risk-taking neurons that are key to generating the sorts of novelties and stirring the pot and getting off-the-wall ideas into the picture and so forth, that this might well take a kind of neuron which has restored some of its autonomy. It's not just a slave. It's got some. It's a rebel. It's a feral neuron. And when I trotted this idea out in a number of neuroscientific conferences, a number of people who really know their neurons said, yeah, those are Fonicánimo neurons. There actually are neurons which they had a candidate for feral neurons, and I won't go into all the details, but there do seem to be neurons which have sort of, as it were, more widespread interests. They aren't too local. They have their fingers. They have their dendrites in lots of different pies, and so I think that the future of understanding how the brain does the work it's doing is by recognizing that no two neurons are alike. Not quite. And that's very, very different from a von Neumann computer. The laptop on which I'm conversing with you right now is unbelievably hierarchical and bureaucratic, and the operating system is dictatorial, and there's no part of it that doesn't do what it's supposed to do when it's supposed to do it. This is This is a fascist army of little agents. But brains aren't like that.
It is quite interesting. An interesting bit about the empirical side of homuncular functionalism that I read in your book is how neurons are sort of engaged in this quasi-Darwinian process in which they're battling for resources and to become valuable so that they can remain alive.
They need to survive.
And all of this, again, reminds me to bring back to I know that you've collaborated with him before, but Michael Levin, your colleague, and he has this idea of multi-level competence hierarchies. At all levels of a living creature like you or I, there are smaller and smaller units that are engaged in solving their own problems.
Yeah, absolutely. It's once you get the idea, you keep finding applications of it that make a lot of sense. One of the most obvious is if you think about the celebrated plasticity of the brain. If you punch a hole in somebody's brain somehow, and they've lost a whole lot, millions of neurons, maybe billions. The rest of the brain can often just take over. It can reassign neurons to do the work that those parts were doing. And there are lots of experiments that show the limitations and possibilities of this. Mike Merzenich's experiments with suturing the fingers of monkeys together and watching the almost overnight change in the jobs being done by motor neurons in the motor cortex of those monkeys. Now, how's that done? There's no employer in there. There's no HR, human resources person who's reassigning these neurons. They're finding their way to their new jobs. Why? Because they need work. And they're underutilized, and they see an opportunity to do more work and win more elbow room, more freedom, more. They get a margin of safety that will protect them. They network. They network because that's the way to stay alive.